Since time immemorial, humankind has looked to the stars. The universe has always been a source of fascination and of mystery. How was the cosmos born? What else might the universe contain? And where do we come from? A new space race has begun, and it is already in full swing. Entrepreneurs with visions are embarking on the commercial conquest of space. They transport satellites into space. They deal in orbital data. And they plan to send tourists into space. It is a huge market for bold pioneers. Welcome to SPACETIME, featuring astronaut and scientist Ulrich Walter and an expert on surprises the universe has in store for us. Several companies are already selling trips to outer space as an unbeatable experience for tourists. And that is not wishful thinking. The Russians have flown wealthy space tourists to their part of the International Space Station on several occasions. The satellite market is also growing steadily. The rapid increase in data traffic calls for ever more efficient transmission stations in space. Space mining could be a totally new business field, with fantastic profits from raw materials from outer space. But even today, spaceflight is still a technically highly complex, dangerous, and above all, costly enterprise.
Just once in their life, many people would like to be an astronaut and see the Earth from above. No problem, says the space tourism industry. $250,000 will get you there. And indeed, over the last 5 years, this industry has invested $13 billion. So, will every one of us become an astronaut at some time or other?
Space is a gigantic economic opportunity. Billions are spent in the satellite business alone. But entrepreneurs with visions plan to conquer totally new markets in space. April 2001 saw the start of a new era in the history of spaceflight when the Russian space agency Roscosmos took American businessman Dennis Tito into space, making him the world's first space tourist.
Every time you circle the Earth, it looks different. The cloud pattern is different. The lighting is different. You go over different land masses. And, you cover so much of the Earth because the Earth is rotating underneath you. You say, this is my planet. You look at the atmosphere and you can see how thin it is. And just a wisp of, over the curvature. And, you can understand more how, humans can impact the atmosphere. It's really small when you look at it in comparison to the size of the Earth.
The Russians made the US entrepreneur's dream come true for hard dollars.
Space tourism began with Dennis Tito, but it was far from a smooth start. Why? Because NASA was totally against him flying to the space station. The space station, you see, is actually a public facility. NASA pays money to use it, and that money comes from taxpayers. But NASA didn't want any tourist on the space station. The Russians took a slightly different view. Their attitude was, if we can make money out of the space station, let's go for it. It's also important to know that Dennis Tito was once a committed aerospace engineer. He had studied aerospace technology and worked for NASA, and he simply wanted to travel into space. So he went to the Russians and put $30 million on the table. They were totally unprepared for such a request, but they worked something out, and in the end flew Tito up to the space station. However, that's when the problems really began, because the Americans said, he can't just go roaming around the space station. If he comes into our laboratory, he might flick the wrong switch. So they told the Russians that Dennis could not enter the laboratory unaccompanied. Someone else had to be with him to hold his hand and prevent him from flicking the wrong switch. That was a NASA stipulation. But since then, the situation has become more relaxed. Today, space tourists can move around the space station with more freedom. But as you can see, the early days were not easy. Looking back, I would describe it as a very good start because for the first time NASA understood that space travel is not just something for science but also for the general public. So the organization has learned a great deal. After all, we see today that space tourism is common practice.
Dennis Tito bought his ticket into space from the US company Space Adventures, a space travel agency that cooperates closely with the Russians. Space Adventures decides who can go and carries out the necessary financial and medical background checks. The first female tourist in space was Anusha Ansari, an American self-made millionairess.
Anusha Ansari spent a week on board the ISS when the crew was being replaced. I must admit that at first I was a bit skeptical because I didn't think it was exactly the right environment for a holiday. But as it turned out, everything went wonderfully well. Anusha rolled up her sleeves, helped wherever she could, and was a part of the crew. No problem at all.
7 tourists have now visited the International Space Station, but in 2011 the Americans ended their space shuttle program. Since then, people can only be flown into space on board Russian Soyuz spacecraft. The few places on board are now reserved for regular ISS crews. There are still enough wealthy private passengers who would like to spend a few days in space, but for the time being, holidaying on the space station has been stopped. But if NASA plans to send its astronauts into space with American private firms instead of on board the Russian Soyuz, Roscosmos intends to revive and even expand the lucrative business with space tourists.
What am I supposed to do up there? Just enjoy the view? Astronauts rave about it, but they are up there for a totally different reason.
You don't just fly into space like you might go for a walk. As was the case with the first 7 space tourists, all future space station holidaymakers will also have to undergo a preparatory program, provided they have first passed the health check.
Space travel is an extremely complex business. You don't just send someone up somehow to fly around a bit. When you fire them into space, they are sitting on hundreds of tons of explosive material. That is a risky undertaking, and it requires very careful preparation.
Space tourists train in Star City, the Russian cosmonaut village near Moscow. This training also includes time in a Soyuz capsule simulator. Not that they learn how to operate it, but to make sure they don't do anything wrong. After about 6 months preparation, they fly to the ISS, which was designed solely for scientific use.
Since it's actually a laboratory, the International Space Station is not really suitable for tourism. No one would spend their holiday in a laboratory on Earth. A few rich people have paid a visit to the ISS. But that isn't the space tourism I'm talking about. I'm referring to projects specially geared to flying tourists into space.
Space tourism as a business model, that is something several firms believe in. One of them, Virgin Galactic, the space enterprise owned by British billionaire Richard Branson. His concept, a few minutes of weightlessness and a top-level view of the world for $250,000 a ticket.
Here on the edge of the atmosphere, at an altitude of about 100 kilometers, you can experience weightlessness for about 7 or 8 minutes. And that gives you a good impression, but it's a relatively brief one, because the spacecraft is on a parabolic trajectory. The thruster ignites and you really are taken up 100 kilometers to the edge of the atmosphere. The spacecraft then descends ballistically into the thicker layers of the atmosphere. Finally, you land.
Spaceship Two was designed to take up to 6 passengers into suborbital space. But in October 2014, Virgin Galactic suffered a serious setback. On a test flight over the Mojave Desert in California, the prototype called Enterprise broke up in mid-air. The co-pilot was killed and the pilot seriously injured. An investigation conducted by the US National Transportation Safety Board ruled that the accident was the result of co-pilot error. But despite the disastrous loss of his spaceship, Richard Branson still believes that he can realize his dream. 16 months after the accident, Branson presented its successor, Unity.
It's a new dimension you can experience up there. Weightlessness and seeing the Earth actually being above it yourself. That's obviously worth something. And so people will seize the opportunity to fly into space as tourists.
Another company offering suborbital space flights is Blue Origin. Founded by Amazon boss Jeff Bezos, the project is developed in great secrecy. Here too, the principle is the classic launch into a suborbital parabola, a U-shaped trajectory. The plan is to transport 6 space tourists to an altitude of just over 100 kilometers. On the edge of space, the capsule will detach from the rocket and climb still higher on a ballistic curve into space before descending to Earth on parachutes. Blue Origin 2 promises its passengers a fantastic view and a few minutes of weightlessness.
Is that space travel? Technologically, it's just a big leap of 100 kilometers to the vertex of the parabola with 0 speed, compared with 7.6 kilometers per second in Earth orbit. From a technological point of view, there's still a lot of difference between the two.
Both the carrier rocket and the capsule will be reusable, and tests are proving successful. Blue Origin has named its rocket New Shepard after the first American in space, Alan Shepard.
So, does flying into space for $250,000 make you an astronaut? I think that's a question we need to take a closer look at. Where, for instance, does space actually start? Space is defined as the region more than 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Why that? Let's assume you want to fly very fast in an aircraft. Only below 100 kilometers will it have aerodynamic lift. In other words, no aircraft can fly higher than that. That's why the term space is used for regions above 100 kilometers. So now, clever companies are saying, fine, we'll fly to a height of 104 kilometers. We'll just scrape by on outer space and come straight back. And everyone who has been up there will get a really nice certificate with the words Space Traveler on it. That's the official term. But anyone who thinks that will make them an astronaut is very much mistaken. There's an International Astronauts Association, the Association of Space Explorers, and it defines an astronaut as someone who has completed at least one orbit of Earth. The suborbital flights are not orbital flights. In other words, to become an astronaut, you would have to pay at least $45 million in order to fly around the Earth several times, on the space station, for instance. So anyone who is just a suborbital tourist is not automatically an astronaut. That, unfortunately, is a fact.
According to that definition, his first flight into space didn't make Alan Shepard an astronaut either. Like the tourist flights planned by Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, Shepard's excursion into space was suborbital. He did not circle the Earth. February 1961, a Redstone rocket took him up to the height of 187 kilometers. He returned to Earth with the help of gravity. Only after his flight to the Moon in 1971 was Alan Shepard able to consider himself a true astronaut. To date, there have been 7 tourist flights to the ISS, which hurtles around our planet at a speed of 28,000 kilometers an hour. A suborbital flight can in no way be compared with a flight to the space station and several days spent in zero gravity.
What exactly does a space tourist experience on a suborbital flight? At an altitude of 12 kilometers, he or she is thrust almost vertically upwards for about a minute with a force of 3 Gs. At an altitude of 50 kilometers, the engines are switched off, and the spacecraft continues in a free flight phase up to a peak of 104 kilometers. It then drops back to 50 kilometers above the Earth in free fall. The entire free fall phase lasts about 3 minutes. The spacecraft then glides in the atmosphere and is slowed with a force of 4.5 Gs. Finally, at an altitude of 12 kilometers, the tourist heads for home. What I'm often asked is, what can you see at an altitude of 100 kilometers? The answer is not very much. The horizon is about 1,000 kilometers away. But there is no way you can see that far. At best, you can see everything within a radius of 400 kilometers. And that's not much. Furthermore, and this is an important point, the moment you become weightless, you feel sick. So unfortunately, space sickness also affects people on a suborbital flight. That's just the way it is.
Spaceport America, the world's first private spaceport, was built in the desert of New Mexico, especially for charter flights into space.
Space tourism will come, and in the not-too-distant future. I reckon we'll have space tourism in less than 10 years, and it will be a commercial success.
Until then, the big money will be earned in the classic utilization of near-Earth space, in transporting satellites into space, and in supplying the International Space Station. One man placing his faith in this now routine business is Elon Musk with his space company SpaceX. With his launch vehicles, this visionary and founder of the Tesla electric car company successfully flies payloads for NASA and for private customers. In 2012, Dragon, the freight spacecraft developed by SpaceX, docked onto the ISS for the first time. SpaceX has contracts with NASA for at least a dozen supply flights to the space station. It's a deal worth billions, but SpaceX is not the only company with lucrative contracts. US arms company Orbital ATK also flies supplies into space with its space freighter Cygnus. NASA has to economize. The days of unlimited budgets ended long ago, so now the US Space Agency cooperates and supports private firms. They can develop and operate their systems much more efficiently and at a lower cost than a government authority. The Dream Chaser is based on a totally different concept. The space glider is also designed to transport freight into low Earth orbit. In contrast to rival capsules, however, it can land at any airport. The Dream Chaser is built by another American company, SpaceDev. A manned version was also supposed to fly astronauts to the ISS, but NASA said no. In the meantime, the Europeans have shown an interest in the mini-shuttle, which could offer Europe low-cost access to Earth orbit. NASA is gradually pulling out of near-Earth spaceflight.
After the Columbia shuttle disaster in 2003, the general public began to ask questions. What exactly are we doing? Just traveling time and again on the shuttle to the space station? Orbiting the Earth on the ISS? And then coming back? We're space pioneers. That's not enough. You're right, NASA said. So this is what we will do. We'll divide space up into near-Earth space, cislunar space, including the moon, and translunar space, which is everything beyond it. We'll focus on the moon and translunar space ourselves. We will then transfer everything that is near Earth to small private space companies, new companies which we will support financially. That's why in 2006, NASA presented a new multi-billion-dollar program precisely for supporting companies like these.
The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
For decades, spaceflight was the domain of the Russians and Americans. In the early 80s, however, Europe opened up its own corridor into space. As the first commercial enterprise, Arianespace, a European joint venture, has been launching satellites into space ever since the mid-80s. Through the Ariane family of launch vehicles, the Europeans were the first to prove that money can be made with spaceflight.
In Europe, we've privatized carrier rockets, for example, a lot earlier than the Americans. In Arianespace, we have a commercial company which has marketed the rockets with great success for many, many years. Perhaps we haven't spoken about it a lot. We didn't immediately call it New Space.
Satellites facilitate the efficient and, above all, swift transfer of information via telephone, television, and the internet. And satellites gather vast quantities of data. It's a business worth billions.
Telecommunication is certainly the prominent area where commercialization is already well advanced. But nowadays, there are companies in the field of Earth observation, too, highly successful in marketing products, not just data, but products developed from data. This will continue. The universe has become part of our daily infrastructure.
In Europe, Arianespace is still the market leader in the satellite business, but real innovations usually come from overseas.
What we lack are the classic Elon Musks, the Bezos, and so on. The business climate in America, it seems, is better suited to investors being given development opportunities.
The latest business idea from Virgin Galactic founder Richard Branson is a flying launch platform for mini-satellites. The small satellite business is booming, and Branson plans to launch them into space from a converted jumbo jet. At the same time, SpaceX is working flat out on a passenger version of its Dragon spaceship. In the future, SpaceX plans to fly US astronauts to the ISS and back for NASA. The capsule can carry 7 astronauts. Like the company's rockets, it will land independently and be reusable. The SpaceX business model is based precisely on the principle of reusability. With more than 25 launches of its Falcon 9, the private space company has proved that it is a serious competitor in the market. With the Falcon 9 Heavy, it is testing a heavy cargo rocket. The goal is to reduce launch costs dramatically.
Say the cost of a Falcon 9 rocket, which is quite a big rocket, it's about 1 million pounds of thrust. It is the lowest cost rocket in the world, but even so, it's about $50 to $60 million. But the cost of the fuel and oxygen and so forth is only about $200,000. So obviously, if we can reuse the rocket, say 1,000 times, then that would make the capital cost of the rocket per launch only about $50,000.
With its reusable rockets, SpaceX plans to offer transports into space for less than $10 million. A price no other satellite carrier could compete with.
I think it's extremely important to understand that one of the main cost drivers in spaceflight is, of course, transportation. If I can massively reduce the cost per kilogram of taking something up into the atmosphere, then I will have achieved a quantum leap, so to speak.
Dann hätte ich gewissermaßen so einen Quantensprung geschafft.
But SpaceX has also had its setbacks. On September 1st, 2016, 2 days before it was scheduled to lift off, a Falcon 9 rocket exploded on its launch pad at the US spaceport at Cape Canaveral. The rocket and the launch pad were completely destroyed. The payload was also lost. It consisted of a communication satellite built by the Israeli company SpaceCom at a cost of around $195 million. Spaceflight remains a risky business. Among other things, Amos 6, the communication satellite which burnt up on board the SpaceX rocket, was intended to help spread Facebook to African countries with poor internet provision. But Elon Musk has his sights set solely on the future. Only a few weeks after his Falcon 9 exploded, the visionary presented his plans for conquering Mars.
I think as we show that this is possible, that this dream is real, not just a dream, it's something that can be made real, I think the support will snowball over time. And I should say also the main reason I'm personally accumulating assets is in order to fund this. So I really don't have any other motivation for personally accumulating assets except to be able to make the biggest contribution I can to making life multiplanetary.
Elon Musk is striving for nothing other than the long-term colonization of Mars. To achieve this, he plans to develop spaceships that could fly hundreds of settlers to our planetary neighbor. The aim is to have 1 million people living on Mars within 2 or 3 generations.
There are entrepreneurs who see that space can be turned into a commercial enterprise. In my view, in a way, Elon Musk is to spaceflight what Henry Ford was to the car industry with his Tin Lizzie.
For a long time, private US aerospace firms were not taken seriously in Europe. But the newcomers to the sector have developed into serious players on the satellite market. The rocket business is experiencing some radical changes. In the near future, the ISS will be decommissioned. This could create a new market. Even seasoned professionals are fascinated by the experience of weightlessness and the sight of Mother Earth from above.
No matter what time you come here, it's fantastic. It's also the rule that when you are here and someone else arrives, they are always made welcome. And when there are 3 of you, it's great to look out together and show one another the countries you know, the places you've been on holiday, and your hometown. I've spent a lot of time here with Vito, gazing at Europe. We've looked at Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. We've seen many places we've traveled together. And it's fantastic seeing them from here.
Russia could create a totally new orbital station from its ISS modules, finance them through flights with tourists. The waiting lists are full. There are enough people prepared to pay a lot of money for an excursion into space. The Russians have taken tourists to the station in the past, proof they have the means. But the space station was designed as a laboratory, and there are good reasons why NASA plans to end its involvement in 2024.
The ISS has a limited service life. From a technology point of view, this will end in 2024, 25, or 28. And it will not be possible to use the ISS as a hotel or something similar after that. On Earth, it doesn't really matter if there's a bit of a draft coming in through the window. In outer space, it's lethal.
US company Bigelow Aerospace plans to build an actual space hotel with residential modules that only inflate in space.
The great thing about these inflatable modules is that they can be used very flexibly. Bigelow is actually a hotel operator. His idea was to create a hotel in space, along the lines of, if I assemble a lot of modules together, then I've got a flying hotel. What he didn't think about, of course, was the need for supply spaceships and a means of transport for getting tourists up to his hotel. And there still isn't one. So he was left sitting on his modules. But then NASA came and said, "Hey, Bigelow, that's just what we're looking for. We need a flexible module on the space station, and we'll test it up there. We might perhaps require it later for the moon and for the long-term mission to Mars." So they came to an agreement, and since then, the thing has been flying up there on the space station. But NASA is still a bit bit suspicious. There were two questions. First of all, would such a module with a flexible surface withstand an asteroid impact? Secondly, what about the radiation up there? Is a module like that radiation resistant? So they inflated it and installed lots of sensors. At the moment, no one is allowed to live in it or stay there. Measurements will be taken for a whole year, and only if everything functions acceptably will NASA give its approval for the system to be used later, which I think will be the case.
Other entrepreneurs are toying with the idea of converting the ISS into a profitable test laboratory in space. Some experiments are already being conducted on the station for the private sector. Only on the ISS can extended series of tests be carried out under microgravity conditions. Material researchers and pharmaceutical companies have shown considerable interest.
So what does the future hold for the International Space Station? The Americans have said they will continue to operate it themselves until 2024, but not after that. They would, however, have no objection to private companies taking over the ISS and operating it on a private basis. You can even have it for free, they say. You'll just have to supply it yourselves and launch those space vehicles from American soil. And what do the Europeans say? Well, we don't know if we're going to continue through to 2024. And that's also what the Russians are saying. So what will probably happen is exactly what the Americans always wanted: the commercialization of near-Earth space, supply flights to the space station and operation of the space station by the private sector, with launches taking place from American soil. And what is the situation in Europe? Well, there's no legal ruling on launching a rocket into space from European soil. There isn't even a single launch pad in Europe. In November 2015, a law was passed in the United States permitting American companies to launch spacecrafts. And until a similar law is passed in Europe, no European company will invest in the sector. That's the problem in Europe.
Consequently, visionary entrepreneurs are not basing their space companies in Europe. Blue Origin founder Jeff Bezos, SpaceX chief Elon Musk, and Richard Branson all operate from the promised land of privatized space travel, and that is still the United States.
Obviously, we need to think on a slightly broader scale. And Elon Musk from SpaceX operated with totally different figures. Naturally, he allows himself to be handsomely supported by the public purse. But that is exactly what a successful entrepreneur does.
At present, the only true entrepreneurial spirit being shown in Europe is in Luxembourg. The tiny Grand Duchy wants to become a pioneer in the space mining sector.
Luxembourg plans to become the first European country to establish a clear environment for exploring and utilizing space resources. The Luxembourg government is also prepared to support promising research and development projects and to invest capital in corresponding enterprises.
Mining for mineral resources in outer space sounds like science fiction, but entrepreneurs are giving it serious thought.
The question of raw materials from outer space can be answered just as simply as it was on Earth. For years, extracting oil from sand in Canada was thought to be impossible. The idea of bringing up oil from the depths of the Earth was seen in the same light. But look what has been achieved. It's perfectly natural for man to turn to space as well.
The quest for profit from space is firing the imagination of investors. Firms are already raising money so that one day they hope to be able to mine precious metals on asteroids. They plan to take possession of comets and exploit them, just like the oceans on Earth are also exploited for oil.
We recently learned that through unilateral legislation, certain states have given themselves and their citizens permission to take possession of asteroids. As a European state, Luxembourg, it's said, would like to follow suit. In my opinion, caution is most definitely called for. No single state can acquire ownership rights to celestial bodies or to the resources on them.
Ressourcen auf Himmelskörpern erwerben.
But NASA too is working on concepts for utilizing raw materials from space for its own ends. The US Space Agency plans to land on an asteroid and collect a large rock, which will then be placed in lunar orbit for closer study. Water is bound to minerals on celestial bodies. This water could be tapped and used. Split into hydrogen and oxygen, it would constitute a huge source of rocket fuel in space. Manned missions into the depths of our solar system would need huge quantities of fuel which cannot be transported from Earth. That would be too expensive. But a direct supply in space would solve the fuel problem. With 3D printers, spaceship components or spare parts could be manufactured directly in space from the raw materials that exist there. Above all, though, the mission is expected to advance technological know-how, and that will be necessary if NASA is to realize its plans for a journey to Mars, for instance.
If you ask potential space mining companies how they plan to make their money, you usually get two answers. The first is, well, there are asteroids or small meteoroids comprised of platinum and gold. And if we bring that back to Earth and sell it, we'll make a load of money. Basically, that's correct, but the rocks are usually very small, only about this size. The really big asteroids with a diameter of 50 or 100 meters are usually also referred to by scientists as flying heaps of scree. And that doesn't sound like platinum and gold. No, they usually consist of dust and snow, which are a bit hard to sell on Earth. But what can be done with asteroids, and this is the second point, is that you can make fuel from them. All you need is the sun's energy. So people then say, okay, we'll set up a filling station on an asteroid. And if we want to fly from the Earth to Mars or the Moon, we'll drop in at the filling station, top up, and continue our journey. I can sort of imagine that, but when exactly will we be able to fly regularly to Jupiter or Mars and refuel along the way? There's no way that will happen for several hundred years. So I reckon these companies are going to need a lot of staying power.
The Moon is also interesting as a source of raw materials. The craters at the lunar poles are thought to contain large quantities of ice. This ice, too, could be converted into fuel, turning the Moon perhaps into a huge near-Earth filling station. The Moon also plays a central role at a young German aerospace company. Internet giant Google has put up a prize of $30 million for a return to the Moon, and Robert Böhme, with his startup company Part-Time Scientists, took part. The competition involves building a rover, landing it on the Moon's surface, and covering a distance of 500 meters with it.
We've made a fair bit of progress of late. For example, there was this intermediate competition, the Milestone Prize. It was worth $750,000 and we won it.
The Berlin company is the only German participant still in the competition. It even plans to send 2 rovers to the Moon. They will touch down near the old Apollo 17 landing site. They will also examine the Moon rover left behind on the last manned flight to the Moon.
Basically, it's about moving commercial spaceflight forward. So when you take part in the competition, you think about what exactly is required. Somehow, you need a rocket. You need a lander to get you down to the Moon. And you need a lunar vehicle. We started by building the lunar vehicle because you can drive around with it, and that's the easiest part of the competition.
Young entrepreneurs in Berlin who want to build aerospace technology. At first, most investors in Germany found that inconceivable.
When you work on something like that in Germany, the problem is that many German companies don't really take you seriously. They don't believe anything that innovative can ever come from Germany. And I'm talking mainly about the bigger companies. Our initial support came mainly from small and medium-sized companies. We really are lagging a few years behind.
Conditions in space are extreme. temperatures on the moon fluctuate between plus 100 and minus 150 degrees Celsius. So if a moon rover is to function after landing, it first has to be tested on Earth in such extreme temperatures. Once the rover has landed, any design defects can no longer be corrected. The part-time scientists are being backed by a German car maker, and the robot is subjected to stringent tests at extreme temperatures in its climate laboratory.
We have a rover that definitely meets lunar demands. It can even carry out scientific experiments. Now comes the more exciting part, where we have to build the lander. We're highly optimistic that we will be able to fly to the moon with it in late 2017 or early 2018.
The lander, which will fly the rover to the moon for the Berlin scientists, is at the final development stage. The lander and the rover will be fired into orbit by a commercial firm. The young entrepreneurs will have to finance the launch out of their own pockets. The Berlin project is on schedule, and the mission stands a good chance of success.
We really do have a lot of good ideas in Europe, but we always find it hard to convert these ideas into commercial products. In this respect, it's extremely important to have visions and to pursue them.
The US company Space Adventures has totally different plans. This travel agency for space tourism plans to offer its clientele a journey to the moon, but without landing there. The plan is for wealthy passengers to make one orbit of the moon at a cost per ticket of $150 million.
That is certainly feasible with present-day technology. The question is, how much money would someone be willing to invest in developing and building such a system and getting it approved for transporting passengers?
The view, however, would be spectacular and extremely exclusive.
Why do we all suddenly want to go back to the moon? Kraft Arnold Ehricke, a 1950s aerospace engineer, once said, "If the good Lord had wanted us to travel in space, he would have given us the moon." Why that? Because the moon is only a 3-day flight from Earth. It's a perfect place for testing new technologies. And that is precisely what the Google X Prize is about. They're saying, so show us that you can land on the moon. Show us that you can live independent of the Earth for days, weeks, and months. And who wouldn't spend a lot of money to fly to the moon one day, maybe land on it, and then look back at this wonderful small blue marble we call the Earth? Other voices say they want to travel to the far side of the moon and build radio telescopes so that they can look into the depths of the universe. There, they would no longer be hampered by radio and television signals from Earth. So scientists would also like to return to the moon.
And that is exactly what ESA, the European Space Agency, has planned in cooperation with Russian aerospace agency Roscosmos. The two organizations want to fly to the moon in cooperation, first with unmanned space vehicles and then later with astronauts. Aerospace experts are increasingly focusing on the moon. When the International Space Station is decommissioned in 2024, the moon could serve as a new scientific outpost in space. First of all, probes will explore the moon more closely than ever before. Above all, they will mount a search for water to make a longer stay on the Earth satellite possible. In the next phase, scientists and engineers plan to establish a complete lunar base. Most of the material for this will come from the moon itself. Planners envisage an international research station for developing new technologies, manned by alternating international crews along the lines of stations in Antarctica. Our moon offers lots of possibilities.
The moon is highly interesting because it can serve as a springboard into outer space. To think of all the things that will be possible in the next few years, like establishing a lunar base and refueling rockets on it or further flight to Mars. You could describe the moon as the paddling pool of spaceflight. It's relatively easy to get there, and if something goes wrong, you can just board a rocket and simply fly back to Earth.
But a manned return to the moon for its commercial utilization is not yet viable.
I believe Earth observation will be the next sector to experience a boom. All other sectors require substantially more investment. So although it's a vast field, I reckon that Earth observation is the sector that will continue to grow fastest.
Investors are hoping for truly fantastic profits from the infinite deposits of raw materials in space.
Naturally, problems will have to be overcome. But if the materials are really interesting with high added value, then it will, of course, happen.
Without visions, the future conquest of space will not be possible.
Finally, it's about exploration, advancing into new worlds and discovering new things, and above all, generating inspiration on Earth. That's one of the aspects I personally find most important of all.
Space tourists will also bring inspiration back with them, and this market will soon exist.
I can honestly say that I wish that would happen tomorrow rather than the day after, because I'm firmly convinced that if more people had the opportunity to enjoy this view, the sooner we would succeed in improving human coexistence here on Earth.
Space, it seems, offers endless possibilities for making money.
If you ask me, in the future, space will become a truly booming business. Not so much space mining with platinum and gold being obtained from asteroids and millions of tons of those metals being brought back to Earth. Believe me, they just don't exist out there. And even if they did, all the precious metal markets on Earth would collapse. So I think we can forget that. But there are also plans to establish filling stations on asteroids. And in the more distant future, I think that could prove interesting. If we flew regularly to Mars, filling stations would be a good thing. But as I said, in the more distant future. We need to fly regularly into near-Earth orbit. We need private companies to offer that possibility. And they will make a lot of money. And then, of course, there's space tourism, suborbital flights, shooting into space and coming straight back within a few minutes for $250,000. I think those companies will also make a lot of money. And so will space hotels. How about a week up there looking down on Earth? Fantastic! And not all that expensive, for a few $1 million perhaps. And where will this take place? Not so much in Europe, that's certain. There aren't even the right laws in place yet. More likely in America, and one day in China too, I reckon.
Even if mining raw materials on asteroids and even mass tourism in space still lie in the distant future, spaceflight will become increasingly privatized, and space as a business field lures entrepreneurs with fantastic profits.